In 2019, a Chinese semiconductor research institute filed a cluster of patents around advanced chip packaging, specifically around a technique called chiplet integration, which is the method of connecting multiple smaller chips into a single high-performance unit, rather than manufacturing one large, expensive chip from scratch. The filings were noted by a small number of analysts and largely passed over. The consensus at the time was that China remained years behind in the underlying manufacturing process, and if the manufacturing couldn't reach advanced nodes, the technical term for the smallest, most powerful transistor sizes, then the packaging work on top of it was academic, an interesting footnote, not a signal. That read was reasonable given what was visible. What it missed was the question the patents were actually answering. Chiplet integration exists because making a single large chip with perfect yield is extraordinarily difficult and expensive. The more complex the chip, the higher the chance something goes wrong in fabrication, and a failed chip is a total loss. Chiplets solve this by breaking the design into smaller tiles, manufacturing each separately where yields are higher, and then connecting them through a dense, high-speed interface called an advanced package. The logic is elegant. If you cannot reliably manufacture one large chip, manufacture several smaller ones, and assemble them into something equivalent. The package becomes the product. This is not a workaround. Advanced packaging is now central to how every leading chip company in the world designs high-performance silicon. TSMC's CoWoS platform, chip-on-wafer on substrate, is the architecture that makes NVIDIA's H100 possible. Without it, the H100 as a product does not exist. The chip and the package are inseparable. What the 2019 patent cluster suggested, looked at now rather than then, is that a Chinese research institute had identified this dependency and was working backward from it. Not, how do we manufacture a better chip, but how do we assemble a capable system from the chips we can make? The distinction is the whole argument. Between 2020 and 2022, three things happened in sequence. The U.S. tightened export controls on advanced chip manufacturing equipment, specifically the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines made by the Dutch company ASML, which are required to produce chips at the most advanced nodes. China's domestic foundry capacity at advanced nodes remained constrained, and Chinese government procurement of advanced packaging equipment from domestic suppliers increased by a figure that one industry analyst in a 2023 report described as inconsistent with the stated capacity of the facilities receiving it. That last figure, inconsistent with stated capacity, is the detail worth holding on to. The surface reading of this period is straightforward. America restricted the inputs, China struggled to produce the outputs, and the export control regime was functioning as designed. Huawei's chip supply was disrupted. Chinese AI development faced a hardware ceiling. The policy had worked. What that reading does not account for is what was being built in parallel during the same years the restrictions were landing, in facilities whose procurement patterns did not match their declared output. The gap between what those facilities were absorbing in equipment and what they were officially producing is not resolved by the export control narrative. It requires a different explanation. The explanation that fits the data is not comfortable, and I am not going to state it yet because the sequence is not finished. But the 2019 patent filings, the equipment procurement anomaly, and the specific technique China chose to prioritize are three data points that only make sense together. And together, they point somewhere the official account of export control effectiveness has not gone. The mechanism behind advanced packaging is worth slowing down on, because most of the public debate around chip export controls treats packaging as secondary, a manufacturing detail rather than a strategic variable. That framing is how the gap got missed. When you restrict a country's access to advanced chip manufacturing, you are restricting its ability to produce silicon at small node sizes, the transistor density that determines raw processing power. The assumption embedded in that restriction is that processing power scales with node size, and node size requires equipment you can control at the border. Deny the equipment, constrain the node, cap the performance. The logic is clean. What advanced packaging does is complicate that logic in a specific way. When you connect multiple chiplets through a high-bandwidth interface inside a single package, the effective performance of the assembled system can exceed what any individual chip in that package could deliver alone. The bottleneck in traditional chip design is that a processor and its memory sit on separate components connected by a relatively slow external bus. The pathway data travels between them. Advanced packaging moves the memory physically closer to the processor, sometimes stacking it directly on top, and replaces that slow external connection with something orders of magnitude faster. The result is that a chip manufactured at a less advanced node, packaged correctly, can perform tasks that the node restriction alone would suggest it cannot. This is not theoretical. It is the reason NVIDIA's dominance in AI training is not simply about transistor count. It is about memory bandwidth, how fast the chip can move data. And memory bandwidth is, in significant part, a packaging achievement. The H100 uses high bandwidth memory, a stacked chip architecture connected through TSMC's CoWoS platform. The packaging is doing meaningful computational work. Strip it out, and the underlying silicon is substantially less capable. China's packaging research, traced from those 2019 filings forward, was focused precisely on the memory-to-processor interface, not on replicating the most advanced nodes, on closing the bandwidth gap through assembly rather than fabrication. The technical literature coming out of Chinese institutions between 2020 and 2023, published, peer-reviewed, available, showed a consistent preoccupation with heterogeneous integration, which is the engineering term for combining chiplets of different types and functions into a unified package. The volume of that literature increased during the same period the export restrictions were tightening. Now, the strongest case against what this sequence appears to suggest. The counter-argument runs like this. China has a long history of publishing research that does not translate into production capability. Academic output and manufacturing yield are different things, separated by enormous engineering complexity, capital investment, and time. The fact that Chinese institutions were writing about advanced packaging does not mean they were producing it at scale. And without scale, without the ability to manufacture advanced packages reliably and in volume, the research is still academic. The export controls were targeting production capacity, not publication counts. Measuring the policy's effectiveness by research output is measuring the wrong thing. This is a serious argument. It is not a straw man. The history of Chinese semiconductor development includes genuine gaps between announced ambition and delivered capability. The domestic chip initiative that preceded this period, Made in China 2025 tiered, produced results that were real, but consistently slower and narrower than the targets suggested. The pattern of overpromising and under-delivering in Chinese industrial policy is documented enough to treat as a prior. Skepticism about whether packaging research translated into packaging production is not naive. It is calibrated. There is also a subtler version of this counter-argument. Even if China developed genuine advanced packaging capability, the argument goes, it would still be constrained by the underlying chips going into those packages. You can assemble chiplets brilliantly, but if the chiplets themselves are manufactured at less advanced nodes, the performance ceiling remains. Packaging narrows the gap. It does not close it. The export controls were never designed to freeze China permanently. They were designed to buy time, and if they bought time while the US and its allies extended their lead in underlying manufacturing, then the policy worked even if Chinese packaging improved. That version of the argument is harder to dismiss. And I want to be honest. When I first looked at the production data coming out of 2023, my instinct was that the counter-argument would hold. The published research was impressive. The manufacturing evidence was thinner. The gap between the two seemed to support the skeptical read. Then the Huawei Mate 60 Pro arrived in stores. In August 2023, Huawei released a smartphone. That is not, on its face, a geopolitical event. Phones get released. What made this one different was what a teardown revealed when analysts disassembled it. A 7-nanometer chip manufactured by SMIC, China's largest domestic foundry, a company that had been on the U.S. export control list since 2020 and was explicitly denied access to the equipment theoretically required to produce chips at that node. The chip was called the Kirin 9000S. It should not have existed. The U.S. government's public response was careful. Officials said they were investigating. The chip was acknowledged as real. What followed was a period of notably restrained official commentary for something that represented, if taken at face value, a direct empirical refutation of the export control regime's central assumption. Now recall the procurement anomaly from earlier. The equipment absorption figures that one analyst described as inconsistent with the stated capacity of the facilities receiving it. SMIC was among the facilities whose procurement patterns had drawn that description. The gap between what was going into those facilities and what they were officially producing was not an accounting error. It was development. Specifically, it appears to have been the development of a workaround, using older, less restricted equipment in creative combinations to approximate the output of machines China could not import. The technique has a name in semiconductor engineering: multi-patterning. It is slower, more expensive, and lower yield than EUV lithography. It is also not subject to the same export restrictions because it predates them. What this means, traced back to the 2019 patent filings, is that the strategy visible in that early research was not a response to the export controls that arrived in 2020 and 2022. It predated them. China was not redirected by the restrictions. The restrictions arrived to find a redirection already in progress. That is the point where the counterargument, the serious one, about production capability versus research output, stops holding. Because the Kirin 9000S is not a research paper. It is a product in a retail box. The yield is low. The cost per chip is high. The manufacturing process is inefficient by the standards of TSMC or Samsung. All of that is true, and none of it changes what the chip's existence demonstrates. That the production gap the export controls were designed to maintain had already been partially routed around before the controls were fully in place. The packaging dimension lands here with full weight. The Kirin 9000S was not simply a fabrication story. The chip's performance, sufficient to run on-device AI applications that Huawei marketed explicitly as competitive with Western equivalents, relied on packaging decisions that minimized the penalty for being manufactured at a less efficient node. The memory architecture, the bandwidth management, the thermal design that allowed sustained performance without the heat dissipation failures that plague dense chiplet assemblies when the package is not engineered carefully. These were not accidents. They were the output of the research program that began, publicly and in writing, in 2019. What I keep coming back to is this. The export control framework was built on a model of technological dependence that had already begun to erode by the time the framework was finalized. Not because Chinese engineers are uniquely clever, they are working with real constraints and real disadvantages, but because the specific capability being controlled, advanced node manufacturing, was not the only path to the performance outcome the controls were designed to prevent. Packaging was the other path, and the other path had a 4-year head start. The optimistic read of the data, and I want to be precise about what makes it optimistic, is that the gap remains real. 7 nanometers through multi-patterning is not 3 nanometers through EUV. The yield differential matters at scale. American and allied chip manufacturers are not standing still while China closes ground. The controls have slowed something even if they have not stopped it. That part of the counter-argument survives. What does not survive is the claim that the policy was working as designed. A policy designed to maintain a capability gap that was being routed around through a method the policy did not adequately account for is not working as designed. It is working as a pressure that produced an adaptation, and the adaptation is now in retail stores, improving with each production cycle, and informing the next generation of Chinese packaging research in ways that compound rather than dissipate. The honest conclusion is that the export controls accelerated Chinese packaging development more than they constrained Chinese chip performance. Pressure produces focus. The restrictions made advanced packaging not just strategically useful, but existentially necessary, and necessity, applied to a research program that was already running, is a different kind of input than the policy modeled for. In 2019, a cluster of patents around chiplet integration was filed by a Chinese research institute and largely passed over. The consensus was that the underlying manufacturing couldn't support the ambition, so the packaging work on top of it didn't matter. That read felt reasonable at the time. What it was actually describing, without knowing it, was a strategy that had already decided the manufacturing question was the wrong question to be asking. The verdict that the sequence produces is not that China won the chip war. It did not. The capability gap is real, the yield disadvantage is real, and the distance between what Chinese foundries can produce efficiently and what TSMC produces at volume represents years of compounding investment that does not close quickly. Anyone telling you the controls failed completely is not reading the production data carefully. The gap exists. It is just not where the policy assumed it would be, and it is not as stable as the policy needed it to be. What the sequence actually shows is something more specific and more uncomfortable than a binary win or loss. It shows that the strategic decision about which capability to prioritize, not advanced node manufacturing, but the assembly layer that sits above it, was made before the export controls arrived, refined during the years the controls were tightening, and validated by a product that reached consumers while official Washington was still processing whether the manufacturing breakthrough was real. The policy was responding to a strategy that had already moved past the point the policy was targeting. This is where the reluctant part of my read sits, because the packaging capability China built is not easily restricted after the fact. The equipment involved is older, more widely available, and distributed across a supply chain that does not present the same choke points as EUV lithography. A control regime built around a single Dutch company's machines, ASML, has a clear architecture. A control regime built around multi-patterning processes and chiplet assembly techniques that use equipment produced in a dozen countries has no equivalent choke point. The next round of restrictions will be harder to design, slower to implement, and easier to route around, because the routing has already been demonstrated to work. The optimism in my read, and it is genuine, not performed, comes from a different place than most optimism in this space. It does not come from believing the controls succeeded. It comes from what the Chinese packaging achievement actually reveals about the difficulty of the remaining gap. 7 nanometers through multi-patterning with the packaging sophistication required to make it perform adequately represents an enormous engineering effort that produced a result still meaningfully behind the leading edge. The effort required to close from 7 nanometers to 3 through whatever combination of fabrication and packaging innovation comes next is not smaller than the effort that produced the Kirin 9000S. It is larger, and it has to happen against an adversary that is also moving, also investing, and now, finally, also paying attention to the packaging layer rather than treating it as a footnote. What I've watched develop across this period is a policy conversation that kept asking whether China could match American chip manufacturing, when the more important question was whether chip manufacturing was the right variable to be watching. The 2019 patents were an answer to that question. The answer was, probably not, so let's build something the question doesn't cover. 4 years later, the something was in a retail box. 4 years after that, which is approximately now, the research that the Kirin 9000S validated is being applied to AI accelerator designs that are not smartphones, do not have the same power constraints, and are not being evaluated by consumer teardown analysts in the same news cycle. The opening observation from this sequence was that a patent filing got passed over because the manufacturing underneath it looked too weak to matter. That filing was not a boast about manufacturing. It was a declaration about method. The method worked well enough to change what export controls have to target next, and the next round of controls does not yet exist. What this produces going forward is a packaging race that neither side has formally declared, inside a technology competition that both sides are publicly framing around fabrication. The framing is wrong. It has been wrong since 2019. The question now is how long the policy conversation takes to catch up to the sequence that has already played out. Find a flaw in this argument. Seriously, I want to see it.